Is video one in the set of slides that corresponds to content for Wednesday, August 30th and Friday, September 1st. And so just to give you a sense of how these videos are going to work, I think I'm going to break them up into slightly smaller pieces, maybe around 20 minutes. And so I'll ask you to watch probably two short ones on Wednesday and a longer one on Friday. And so what I want to do in this set of content is to introduce information processing theory, which is really the theoretical framework that we're going to be using for much of the discussions that we're going to be having in this class, as well as to talk about two specific processes within information processing theory. Those are the processes of attention and perception. And I'm guessing that we're not going to make it to working memory, and so that's where we'll pick up when we're all together again on Wednesday. And so before we kind of go into the nitty gritty of what information processing theory is, I want to talk about it a little bit, particularly in relation to behaviorism. And so when we talked about critiques of behaviorism, one of the things we said was that behaviorism is a theory of learning that is, of course, focused on behavior. So if you're a behaviorist, for learning to take place, there has to be some kind of change in behavior. So I have to be able to see it. And we know that a lot of learning and a lot of the things that we want to teach students are not about behavior, right? They're cognitive. And what I mean by cognitive is that they happen in the mind. And what that means is that it's internal. So I can't necessarily see it. But the fact that you can read or comprehend what you read, or ask questions about what you read, or design a science experiment, or think about how to solve a math problem, or think about how to write something. That all happens cognitively. So in addition to the behavior of, for example, writing something down, there's a cognitive component where you formulate what you're going to say, you organize information. And behaviorism doesn't have a good explanation for that cognitive component of what happens internally. And so information processing theory is kind of the next stage in our understanding of student learning. And it moves from behaviorism, which is focused on external behavior, to the internal, to the cognitive. And in fact, the development of information processing theory corresponds to what was called the cognitive revolution, which is when psychology really started to focus on these internal processes of what was happening in the mind. And so information processing theory arose in the 1950s and 1960s. Oh, actually, before I go into that, I want to talk, before we kind of talk about what it is as a theory, I want to actually talk about what a theory is. And so all of you guys have probably heard that word thrown around. You've probably learned about theories across all of your subject areas. But when I say theory, I really mean a comprehensive explanation of phenomenon. And so when I talk about information processing theory, I mean a comprehensive explanation of how students learn, an explanation of how students' minds work. And the important thing to know about theories is that they explain evidence that happens. So we have a lot of experimental information, some of which I'll share with you, that supports how we understand, that supports IP theory and that supports IP theory based understandings of learning. So it explains a lot of experimental findings. And on the converse, IP theory also helps to predict as well as interpret a variety of phenomena. So if we design certain other experiments, IP theory tells us how we might expect that data to look. So you probably heard of a lot of theories. If you take a developmental class, you'll hear about early theories of learning, including Piaget, including Vygotsky, including behaviorism, like we talked about. So all of those are really important theories. They still dictate a lot of how we think about learning in a big way. But what I want to talk about as distinguishing IP theory from something like Piaget's theory of learning, Piaget's theory of learning, or even behaviorism, is that IP theory to date is our best explanation of how learning happens. And so it doesn't mean that the theory is completely right. It doesn't mean that the theory is going to change. And in fact, a lot of research on IP theory is going on right now. So for example, when we talk about working memory structure, I'll tell you, well, some people think it's like this and some people think it's like this, but we're not quite sure yet. So that it's still an active area of research. There's still a lot of things to figure out. But in terms of kind of the most accurate in terms of explaining data, explanation for student learning, that's IP theory. So I'm really going to ask you, when you think about how students learn, to adopt this cognitive approach. And it's not complete. There's things that we're going to add to complement to it, but it's our best understanding of how the human mind works. It's our best kind of coherent explanation. So that's what a theory is. What is a model? And of course, if you were in class, I would ask you to turn to your neighbor and tell them, well, what do you think a model is? But when I say model, I think about it as a simplified representation. So in a few slides, I'm going to show you what IP theory looks like. And you'll see that it thinks about the processes of dealing with information as kind of a series of boxes and arrows in terms of what's going on in your head. This will probably be obvious to you when you see IP theory, but I'll just mention that that's a model. And what it means is that it's a representation. It's a way of showing what we think happens, but it doesn't accurately represent what is in your brain, right? So your brain is a set of electrical impulses, right? That's how all this information processing actually happens, through neural connections. And so this model doesn't map what areas of the brain are responsible for what. It's not a neurological approach. What this model does is that, what information processing theory does is that it models the processes of how we deal with information. And what that means is that it represents them, right? It's not an exact replica. It represents them in a simplified form so that we can conceptualize it. So with that in mind, understanding that IP theory is an explanation of how learning happens, but it's also a simplified representation of that, let's talk about what IP theory is. And so a lot of times when we talk about IP theory, we'll say that it's a computer model of the brain. And in fact, IP theory developed in the 1950s and the 1960s, corresponding to the development of a computer. And so whenever we talk about IP theory, we'll talk about the relationships between three memory systems: the sensory register, short-term memory, and long-term memory. And another way of saying sensory register, I should say, is sensory memory. And so we can think about each of those memory systems as analogs within the computer. And so this kind of looks like an old computer. But our computer basically has these three functions. The first is that it can take information in from the environment, and that would be sensory memory. And so that's not processing, that's just taking in information. And so when we apply that to the human mind, we call that sensory memory. And the analog in the computer is anything you can kind of put into the computer. So USBs, CDs, disk drives, DVDs, any kind of cords that you can attach, basically, as a way of getting environmental input. And so just like when I'm talking about the computer here, our IP model is going to start with sensory memory. So in addition to getting memory from the environment, our computer can also process information, as can our mind. And so short-term memory is the processing unit of our memory system. And so you can use the term short-term memory or working memory for this. We can use these terms interchangeably for now. When we talk more specifically about working memory, I'll distinguish the difference between working memory and short-term memory. But for now, they basically mean the same thing, and that's the CPU. That's kind of your processing power. It's what can actually manipulate the information that comes in from the environment. And we'll talk more specifically about what processing is. And then finally, our computer, just like our mind, has a storage capacity, and that's the hard drive. And so when we talk about long-term memory, that's our storage capacity. That's where we store information. And so IP theory can really be understood in terms of taking information in from the environment, processing it, and storing it. And so whenever we talk about IP theory, we're going to be talking about three memory systems. Sensory memory, which is responsible for environmental input. It doesn't do any processing, it just takes the information in. Working memory or short-term memory, which is responsible for our core information processing processes, and we'll talk about what those are, as well as long-term memory, which is responsible for storage. And when we talk about IP theory, what we're really going to be talking about is these three memory systems and the processes that move information across these memory systems. And the last thing that I want to say, as kind of you have things in the back of your mind, is that IP theory is considered to be a cold model of cognition. And what we mean by cold is that it just explains the cognitive processing. It just explains how you take information in, manipulate it, store it. It doesn't ask questions about, well, why you would want to take in certain information over others, or why some information interests you more than others, or why you would want to process some information more deeply, or you're more interested in it than other information, or what motivates you to process information. IP theory doesn't ask any kinds of those motivational or what I'll call warm questions. It's just a cold model. It just talks about how the processing happens, how we take information in, how we process it, how we store it, how we spit information back out. And so with that, I want to introduce you to IP theory. And so just like we talked about with behaviorism, IP theory talks about the relationship between the individual and the environment. Except in this case, the individual is, we're focused on the cognitive part of the individual, right? We're focused in the mind. And so the first big distinction that information processing theory draws is between information out in the environment and information that's internal, information that's in the mind. And so information enters in from the environment into the mind through sensory memory. That's where we get our environmental inputs. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just walk you through IP theory first. You'll see it's pretty comprehensive and pretty complex. And so once I walk you through it, we'll focus on each of the components of IP theory in more detail throughout this set of slides. But for now, information enters into our mind from the environment to our sensory memory through two processes of attention and perception. Some of that information we choose to process. So we don't process everything that we perceive or everything that enters into our sensory memory. But some of it we do. And that goes to our working memory and short-term memory. And that's where information processing happens. That's where information is actively manipulated. And to keep information in working memory, we rehearse it. We'll talk about what that means. And some of the information that we process, we choose to remember or store in long-term memory. And the process of moving information from working memory to be stored in long-term memory is called encoding. And then sometimes we want to pull information out of long-term memory, potentially to help us with processing of new information in working memory. And that process of pulling information out of long-term memory is referred to retrieval. And then we're able to, spit information back out into the environment through our response generator. And so I'll just say that IP theory is very well explained, kind of up to retrieval, so up to storing information in long-term memory and pulling information out of long-term memory. And then if you're curious about how we're able to spit information back out into the environment, how the response generation process takes place, there's not a lot of good information about that. So that's an area of research that's still really developing right now. But kind of very crudely, just like we're able to take information in, we're also able to spit information out. And the last part of IP theory is associated with each of these three memory systems. There's also processes of forgetting. And we can split those up into interference and decay as the two types of forgetting or the two types of information loss. And those are associated with each memory system. And so if we were in class, I would ask you to notice anything you observe about the model, anything that catches your attention. But since we're not in class together, or rather, I'm not in class, I'm just going to mention a couple of things here. So first, notice that the core of IP theory is about these three memory systems that we talked about: sensory memory, working memory, and long-term memory, and the flow of information back and forth across them. And so when we talk about IP theory in depth, we'll be talking about these three memory systems, as well as the 5 processes that connect the different memory systems. And those are attention and perception for moving information from sensory memory to working memory, rehearsal as a working memory process, and encoding and retrieval for specifying the relationship between working memory and long-term memory. And so we're going to be talking about 3 memory systems, 5 cognitive processes. And then the other thing that I want to talk about a little bit on this slide is interference and decay. And when I talk about decay, it's a lack of retrieval. When we don't retrieve information, we lose it. We're not able to retrieve it anymore, and it decays. And so, an example of decay would be within long term memory, would be someone in high school, I learned Spanish, but I haven't talked to anybody in Spanish for over 10 years. And so at this point, my Spanish knowledge has decayed. I can no longer retrieve it. At one point, I encoded it, it was stored in my long term memory, but because I never bothered to retrieve it, it has decayed or I have forgotten it. And decay also happens within sensory memory and working memory. So, for example, someone tells me their phone number, 215 234 1432. And I punch it in, but I don't really properly encode it into long term memory. So I process it, I punch the number into the phone, but I don't remember it. And so I'm not able to retrieve it from long term memory and it decays. So decay is just information loss, and it's typically what we mean when we colloquially talk about forgetting. But there's another type of forgetting that information processing theory talks about, and that's interference. And that's when new information interferes with or interrupts existing knowledge. New information interrupts existing knowledge. And so, an example of that, going back to Spanish, is that in high school I learned Spanish, but in college I learned French. And so now, whenever I go to pull out a Spanish verb, I get a French verb instead. So, my French, my new knowledge, interferes with existing learning, so my Spanish. That's a long term memory example. A short term memory example is I'm meeting people at a party. Someone tells me her name is Shannon, and I say, oh, okay, that's Shannon. And someone right next to her introduces herself as Shauna. And that new information interferes with my existing information. And so now whenever I think Shannon, I think Shauna. And so that new information interrupts the old information that I already had, and I confuse their name. So interference is the interruption of encoding and retrieval. Decay is just an inability to have retrieval. And so I'm going to take you through information processing theory just one more time. And as I do, I'm going to ask you to kind of walk your neighbor through it. So I'm not going to talk, I'm just going to flash everything up on the screen and talk your neighbor through the components of information processing theory. And so hopefully you said something like information enters in through the environment, it goes to our sensory memory through the processes of attention and perception. Some of that information is processed in working memory. Through the process of encoding, some of that information is stored in long-term memory. We're able to also retrieve that information from long-term memory, spit it back out through response generation, and of course, the processes of interference and decay could interrupt memory at every step. And so with that, I'm going to stop here. And so in the next 2 sets of videos, we're going to talk about sensory memory and the processes of attention and perception pretty in depth. Thanks.